Welcome back, class. In this lecture, we will talk about the Anabaptist and the British English Reformation. Now, the notes that you have in the course shell on the Anabaptist are rather sparse. I'm going to fill in a little more detail, so you might want to write some things down. The Anabaptists are typically broken down into three distinct groups: the Radical Anabaptist, the Rationalist Anabaptist, and the Biblicist. So the group that probably had the greatest impact were the Biblicists, the Biblical Anabaptists. These came out of a study group that was begun by Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland in the 1520s. In 1525, they parted ways with Zwingli over the issue of baptism. As they studied the Greek New Testament, as they looked at the early church, they became convinced that the church should only be composed of persons who had, with reasonable age, knowledge, and decision, had committed themselves to following the Lord Jesus Christ and made that commitment public through water baptism. The early Anabaptists practiced baptism by pouring. They would use a bucket or a pitcher or anything that would hold water to pour water over the head 3 times in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so they broke ranks with Zwingli over this, and persecution broke out against them almost immediately because the whole notion of a believer's church undermined the social structures of European Christendom. In European Christendom, to be a citizen in the kingdom, in the realm, was to also be a member of the church through infant baptism. And so the notion of a believer's church undermined the cohesion of the Commonwealth. So persecution broke out almost immediately against them. The early leaders were heavily influenced by a Catholic mendicant movement called the Brethren of the Common Life. And there was a heavy emphasis on good works, whether it was for salvation or an evidence of salvation, depends on who you read. But there was a heavy emphasis on good works and on suffering for the cause of Christ. Some of these leaders suffered horribly before their death. Michael Sattler was tortured all the way to execution with hot tongs. They would stop periodically along the way, use red hot tongs to rip parts of his flesh out. They cut his tongue out before they tied him to the pyre. They dusted his beard and head with gunpowder before they lit the wood underneath him. And his wife was executed a few days later by drowning in the Lamont River. Conrad Grebel died in prison. And so persecution followed the Anabaptists all over Europe. From the biblical Anabaptists came such groups as the Amish, the Mennonites, and the Moravians. These kinds of groups descend from the biblical Anabaptists of the Reformation. The radical Anabaptists were caught up in a kind of prophetic frenzy, if you will. They believed that the end of the world was upon them. There was a group of them known as the Zwickau prophets, and they believed that the millennium was about to happen at any time. One group of radical Anabaptists seized the German city of Münster and declared it the New Jerusalem, set up their own little kingdom in there, legalized polygamy, and ended up a combined force of Protestant and Catholic armies laid siege to the city until everyone inside starved to death. And the leaders' bones were put in iron cages and hung on the city wall until World War II bombing destroyed the wall. As an example, to all not to do such things. And as a result, the very word Baptist became a byword in Germany and could not be used in any way to designate a religious group. So Baptists today in Germany are called free evangelical believers. They don't call themselves Baptist. The rationalists were of the sort that we talked about with Michael Servetus. in the previous lecture on Calvin, the rationalists were typically Unitarian in their approach to the nature of God. They denied the Trinity. They denied the incarnation. They believed that Jesus was a great teacher. And they approached things from a very rational perspective without regard to the supernatural. These would eventually impact General Baptist in England, and we'll talk about that more later, but from their impact on General Baptist would arise the Unitarian Church in England, which eventually became what we know today as the Unitarian Universalist Church. So these are the three basic groups of Anabaptists. Now let's talk about the Reformation in the British Isles. The Reformation in the British Isles begins with what historians call the King's Great Matter. This is Henry VIII. In 1521, he wrote a defense of Catholicism against Martin Luther, for which the Pope bestowed upon him the title Defender of the Faith, a title that English monarchs carry to this day. But he was married to his deceased brother's fiancée, Catherine of Aragon, whose uncle was the Holy Roman Emperor. And she failed to produce a male heir. The only living heir of their marriage was Mary. And the king, determined to have a male heir, decided that he would divorce her. At the same time, he had already begun having an affair with Anne Boleyn, and she was with child with Elizabeth. And so he needed a way out. The Pope could not grant him a divorce because of political situations with the emperor. And so the king arranged for separating the Church of England from the Roman Church, keeping the liturgy, keeping the theology, but seizing all the monastic lands and making himself the titular head of the Church of England, with the Archbishop of Canterbury as the supreme bishop. And so the English church separated from the Roman church as a matter of political convenience. And so we all know Henry VIII went through a series of wives involving divorces and executions and deaths in childbirth, these kinds of things. He had three surviving heirs: Mary, who was a devout Catholic, a son, Edward, who was Protestant, and a daughter, Elizabeth. And so each of these would have their turn on the throne. Now, during this time, Lutheran influences came to Cambridge University, and Cambridge kind of became a Protestant think tank for the English church. The Protestant influences from Lutheranism are reflected early on in the Book of Common Prayer that was developed under Edward and then finalized under Mary. So let's talk first about Protestant reforms under Edward VI. Edward VI only ruled for a few years before he took ill and died. Had he lived, his reign probably would have been a remarkable one. He certainly, if you study his life, he certainly was intelligent, extremely intelligent, very courageous, very bold, and a deeply personally devout Protestant believer. He sought to bring the best of Protestantism to bear on the Church of England. But he died of disease after only a few short years on the throne. And as things fell out, his sister Mary, who was a devout Catholic, came to the throne. As a result, Protestants were forced to flee England as she launched a wave of persecution across the land against those who had so ill-treated her mother. And Mary's reign was one of terror. And under her reign, Hugh Latimer and Ridley were executed. We'll talk about them in a moment. But Mary sent Protestants fleeing, and most of them did not go to Germany. They went rather to Switzerland. They went to Geneva, where they studied under Calvin and under Beza, and they imbibed deeply the Reformed theology of John Calvin. And this is what they would bring back to England when they came back. Ridley and Latimer were executed, burned at the stake. One said to the other as they approached the fire, said, "Play the man, and we shall light a torch today in England that shall not easily be put out." And so they were burned alive at the stake by Queen Mary. Mary died probably of ovarian or uterine cancer. More than once, she was believed to have been with child and turned out not to be, and then became very sick and died. And most historians today, scholars, tend to think it was some form of ovarian or uterine cancer. And upon her death, Elizabeth the first became queen. Elizabeth was very much concerned with the peace of the realm, and the realm was in tumult over divisions between those who wanted an independent English church and those who wanted a Catholic church, and she wanted to try to please everybody. And so Elizabeth pursued what we call a via media, the middle way. She sought to retain the best, as she perceived it, of the liturgical aspects of worship and the liturgical orders and all of these kinds of things, while at the same time holding on to a Protestant theology. And the Protestant theology the attempt was made in the Book of Prayer to make especially the liturgy for the sacrament worded in such a way that it would be acceptable to Calvinists or Lutherans. So it was very broadly worded. How it played with the idea of real presence was designed to appeal to both Catholics and Lutherans, but the form of it would appeal to Catholics. And so she's trying to make everybody happy, and that never works. And so what we have is the Puritan response to Elizabeth. These are scholars who traveled to Switzerland, who studied under Calvin and under Beza and the Swiss Reformation, and they bring back the Calvinistic influences of Geneva. And you got to understand that Calvinism is a low church vision of worship, whereas Lutheranism is a high church vision of worship. Lutheranism is much more like a Catholic liturgy. Calvinism, in its original form, was very low church. Luther believed that whatever the Bible does not forbid is permitted in worship. Calvin believed that whatever the Bible does not command is forbidden. So there's two totally different approaches here. Calvin's idea is called the regulative principle, that God regulates what is allowable in worship on the basis of the second commandment. So if God does not expressly command it, you shouldn't do it. And so the goal of the Puritans was to rid the Church of England, to purify it of the last vestiges of papal influences. That's how they viewed their calling. The Puritans were predominantly Calvinistic, though not universally so. In Scotland, Calvinism was brought there through John Knox, who just before Elizabeth came to the throne published a book on the evils of women ruling. Bad timing on his part. But so this gives you a sort of a picture of Puritanism, and we'll have more to say about Puritanism when we come to discuss the dissenters later on. The next thing we want to talk about in this lecture, we want to deal with the Counter-Reformation. How did the Roman Catholic Church respond to the Protestant Reformation? We need to talk about, it's called the Counter-Reformation. Rome's early responses were in the form of rebukes and excommunications. Rome published everything they said in Latin, so that only people who could read Latin knew what Rome was talking about, whereas the reformers published in French and German and English in the language of the peoples. And so the reformers won the publicity war because they published in the language of the common people. The Catholic Church published only in Latin, as this was the official language of the church. But the early Catholic response was in the form of rebukes, threats, and excommunications. Eventually, the Council of Trent was called. The Council of Trent met over a period of about 20 years. And the Council of Trent affirmed what we call the Apocrypha, the Old Testament Apocrypha, as part of Scripture. The Council of Trent affirmed the doctrine of infused righteousness. The Protestants argued for imputed righteousness, that God credits the righteousness of Jesus to the believer by faith. The Catholic Church argued that God infuses a principle of righteousness in the new believer, which the new believer must then build upon with good works done in love to maintain and increase his or her state of righteousness. The Council of Trent rejected the Augustinian view of grace and free will, in effect renouncing the 10th century Synod of Orange's decision. The Council of Trent affirmed the 7 sacraments. Protestants typically had 2, Lutherans had 3, but the Swiss Reformation had 2, baptism and the Lord's Supper, but the Catholic Church affirmed 7 sacraments. And the sacraments in the Catholic Church, you have to understand, these are not merely signs and symbols of grace. They are the means by which grace is received. The Church dispenses grace like medicine in measured amounts through the various sacraments. And the Council of Trent anathematized key Protestant doctrines and declared as heretics and persons condemned to hell anyone who holds these doctrines. And these anathemas remained firmly in place until Vatican II. We'll talk about that much later. Also within the Catholic Church, there was a renewed Augustinianism. There's a group called the Jansenists. And these were a group of Roman Catholic leaders who embraced a robust vision of Augustine's concept of grace and free will. They were declared heretical by Pope Innocent X and purged from the church. Another interesting person in this time period is Louis de Molina. Louis de Molina was a scholar and a priest who advocated that God used middle knowledge in ordering the universe. And so his view is called Molinism, and it has received a fair bit of attention outside of the Catholic Church among both Arminians and Calvinists. Middle knowledge, first of all, what is it? Well, it is what God knows of counterfactuals, of what would have been if certain things had happened. For instance, if you read in 1 Samuel during the time of King David when he's running from Saul, he's holed up in a city and Saul finds out he's there. And Saul's troops are marching on the city to get David. And David asked the Lord, will the people of this city surrender me to King Saul? And God says, yes, they will. So you better run. Well, that's middle knowledge. God knows what the people of the city would do if David stayed. You see. So it's conditional knowledge. It's what would happen if these conditions prevailed. Jesus seems to demonstrate this same kind of knowledge when he talks about to Capernaum, if the miracles that had been done here had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities would have remained until this day. It's a conditional knowledge. Middle knowledge is a knowledge of we call them counterfactuals, things that could have been but aren't. So the idea here is that God in his infinite knowledge knows all these counterfactuals, and so he has chosen out of that to create a universe where all of the events that he desires to happen will freely come to pass through the actions of his intelligent, sentient, created beings. And so this has especially received some attention in recent years among some Calvinistic writers, especially Bruce Ware at Southern Seminary does a fair bit with this. If you want to read a good counter response, Dr. John David Lang has written a dissertation showing how that using the concept of middle knowledge really doesn't help solve the tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Next, let's talk briefly about how the Reformation impacted the Eastern Orthodox Church. And we begin with a review of the differences between the Greek and the Latin churches. Questions over papal power. Well, the Protestants would be on the side of the Greek Orthodox Church on this question. The Filioque clause. The Protestants would be on the side of the Latin Church on this question. So they've got things in common already with the Orthodox Church. They've got things not in common with the Orthodox Church. The concepts regarding sin and salvation between the East and the West are different. The East focuses on deification. The West focuses on justification. The Reformers rejected icons. This is a big issue for the Orthodox Church, as you know. Then we have the problem of the Uniate Church. We've talked about the Uniate Church already a little bit. This crossing over of Orthodox believers to the authority of Rome so long as they could keep their Eastern rituals. But Reformed doctrine became involved in the struggle between East and West. The borderlands of Eastern Europe tended to embrace forms of Calvinism. Lutheran thought spread as far as Muscovy, the province around the city of Moscow. And Cyril Lucaris, an Eastern Orthodox leader, used Protestant texts for responses to Roman incursions in Russia when he was there on a mission from the Patriarch of Constantinople. Lucaris was educated in Europe, and in university he had Protestant contacts and came to have a good, thorough acquaintance with Protestant theology. He became Patriarch of Constantinople in 1620. He promoted learning and reformed doctrine in the Orthodox Church. Up to this time, one of the leading problems with the Orthodox Church was the general illiteracy of the priesthood. He was opposed by the Vatican, and especially by the Jesuits, who feared a union of Protestants in the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Orthodox throne at this time was under the control of the Turkish Sultan and could be bought and sold to the highest bidder. And Lucaris was repeatedly removed from the throne and replaced as Jesuits paid for someone else to be installed, and then Protestant leaders would pay to have him reinstalled. Eventually he was removed from the throne, and in 1638 he was murdered and his body tossed overboard from a ship. The Eastern Church, in the aftermath of Lucaris' death, held regional synods that condemned both Lutheranism and Calvinism by name. Most notably, the Synod of Jerusalem in 1672 condemned the Eastern Confession of Faith, which was a doctrinal confession that had been published under Lucaris' name. The Eastern Church says Lucaris didn't write it, but most Protestant scholars believe that he did. The Synod worked hard to clear Lucaris of any allegations of Reformed sympathies so as to remove any smear from his name in the Eastern Church. The political climate of the Eastern Church made it difficult at this time. They lived predominantly under Muslim rule everywhere outside of Russia. Orthodox bishoprics were often sold to the highest bidder because Muslim rulers controlled them. And the priesthood was plagued with a general state of ignorance. Many of them simply recited the liturgies from memory. They couldn't read or write. And so this is the Reformation at this point. As we look at the Anabaptist, the English Reformation, the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation, and the Reformation as it relates to the Eastern Orthodox Church. And in our next lecture, we'll be moving from the Reformation period proper to the period of Protestant scholasticism.